Good morning, everybody, and welcome along. It is the live stream coming to you at 11 a.m. on the 30th of April, 2024. And we're going to be discussing a number of things today, including some updates from the Ukraine war and the war in occupied Palestine. But before we get to any of that, I will begin by talking about a heroic anniversary. It is, of course, the 30th of April today, and it is 49 years since the final liberation of what was then known as Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, and the final collapse of the Vietnamese comprador regime run by the United States imperialists for many, many years. And it suffered its final defeat on this day 49 years ago. And it is worth commemorating this, of course, for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is one of the most heroic parts of communist and national liberation movements' history throughout the 20th century. One of the key moments in the national liberation struggles against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. And of course, one of the great victories of a communist party in the form of the Vietnamese. So it is worth commemorating for all those reasons, and worth just looking at the enormous sacrifice that the Vietnamese masses had to make to free themselves. First of all, of course, there was a struggle against occupation by the Japanese. Prior to that, there'd been the beginnings of an independent struggle against the French colonialists, who, of course, held all of what was once known as French Indochina, which includes, of course, all of what is now modern-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And so there was then a struggle against the Japanese invaders, who were every bit as wretched and repressive as the French were. Then there was the renewed struggle for independence against French imperialism, that ran from the immediate period after World War II, when the British and the Americans tried to restore rule to the French colonialists. This war waged until the early 1950s, and the final defeat of French imperialism at Dien Bien Phu, masterminded, of course, by one of the great military heroes of the international communist movement in the 20th century, which is General Giap, who masterminded the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu, who organized the transporting of heavy artillery up to points in the high hills above the French base at Dien Bien Phu and bombarded it from above in a move that the French military command never anticipated. This defeat drove the French and the Americans so mad that apparently Truman considered dropping a nuke on Vietnam. And this was, of course, something that he was talked out of. But this was something that they very much considered considering dropping a small nuke on the Vietnamese there. Thankfully, this is something which did not come to pass. Brief correction, it wasn't, of course, Truman who considered that. It was the Eisenhower administration, because this was 1954. So this was, of course, the end of the French period of the struggle against the French. And the struggle then begins almost immediately against the division of the country that was imposed by the American imperialists. So from around 1954 to 55, as soon as the French were forced out, and the US imperialists forced the division of the country and deliberately ignored the massive popularity of the communists in the south of the country and imposed a comprador regime. Then there was a 20-year period of higher intensity and lower intensity war, reaching its peak in terms of savagery in the later 1960s and early 1970s, when the US imperialists had, in 1969, the high point of their occupation and their attempted intervention was when they had 543,000 men serving in South Vietnam. as part of a total of over 2,709,000 who served in total in the occupation army in South Vietnam. This, of course, resulted in a bitter and brutal struggle, a struggle that lasted over 20 years, a struggle which claimed over 1 million Vietnamese war dead on the North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front side, and of course, which led to over 2 million civilians being killed, many by US bombing campaigns. It led to the poisoning of much of the Vietnamese jungle via the distribution of chemical warfare, such as Agent Orange, and the lasting legacy of that, which is, of course, the horrific birth defects which take place in Vietnam every year up to this day, due to the sheer level of toxicity which the US imperialists dumped on that country. But despite all of that, despite the incredible levels of casualties and the incredible suffering that the US imperialists imposed on Vietnam, they ultimately persevered. They beat the wretched Lyndon Johnson. They beat the just as wretched Richard Nixon and forced the imperialists to withdraw, leaving their comprador regime not without assistance, but without US direct military assistance in terms of forces on the ground. The US continued to provide, to a certain degree, air support and, of course, military supplies to the South Vietnamese comprador regime, but it could not last. Shortly before the fall of Saigon in 1975, there were a series of large-scale battles which took place around the in and around the South Vietnamese capital, which ultimately led to a series of catastrophic defeats of the South Vietnamese regime, leading to the fall of Saigon on April the 30th, 1975, which was to become Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh, of course, did not live to see this triumph, but it is very much his triumph in terms of his legacy and his beginning of the struggle all the way back in the 1920s with his joining of the Third International and his organization of the resistance forces in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So this is a heroic day, or one on which we must salute the bravery and steadfastness of the heroic Vietnamese masses and the leadership of the Vietnamese Communist Party. And it is worth remembering this when looking at the scenes coming from Gaza and the scenes coming from any national liberation war against the imperialists, whether it is the Americans, the French, the British, or anybody else. The imperialists, as the Vietnam War revealed, cannot sustain high casualties themselves because, as Mao observed correctly, the ruling class's links with the masses in the United States are always too weak to sustain mass casualties in wars which are seen as, well, not existential for the existence of the United States. So they could sustain higher casualties in World War II because it was able to be portrayed as something which was more existential. They weren't able to do that in Korea. They weren't able to do that in Vietnam because the masses, even if they don't understand this in a communist sense, do understand that Vietnam was not likely to invade the United States. And so they couldn't justify, and in the minds of the masses, couldn't square the sacrifices they were being asked to make with what was actually supposedly the Great Crusade. The Great Anti-Communist Crusade is a bourgeois crusade. It is one that the average politically underdeveloped American worker might have agreed with at some point, but he doesn't see the point of dying for it or being horribly crippled for it. And thus the war effort of the US imperialists could not be sustained. Never mind all the moaning you get from General Westmoreland and his memoirs, or various other reactionaries in the United States claiming that they fought the war with one hand tied behind their back, which is nonsense. 500,000 men deployed in the field is not one hand tied behind your back. What they mean by that is they didn't get to nuke North Vietnam. They didn't get to nuke Hanoi. They did everything else to it. Dropped chemical warfare munitions on North and South Vietnam, carried out horrific massacres. I mean, we know about My Lai and some others, but that was, William Calley was not unique. He was pretty much standard for many American units at the time. We had the horrors of the Phoenix program and all the dirty tricks played by the CIA. But despite all of that, all of the horrors that imperialism could dream up and inflict upon the Vietnamese masses, they still triumphed. They still forced American imperialism to scuttle out of Saigon, humiliated and scuttling off the roof of their embassy in 1975. So on this day, on April the 30th, we must salute the heroic Vietnamese masses, the Vietnamese Communist Party, and the legacy of Ho Chi Minh for scoring this enormous and heroic victory over US and French imperialism, ultimately. So I wanted to begin the show today by making that tribute to them, and also by calling for everybody to study this as an example of how a long-term struggle, despite incredible sacrifices, if the masses are unified behind the leadership of the Communist Party, the masses can endure despite all the horrors that imperialism can inflict upon them. So with that first section of the program done, I will now pause to greet those who are in the chat so far. Now, we are doing this a little bit earlier than usual because I am on the train to London, the capital of perfidious Albion, because I'll be on the London May Day demonstration tomorrow. So I'm going down this afternoon. I'll be there with comrades from my party, the CPGBML, marching on the march tomorrow. If you're going to that, feel free to pop across and say hello. I'll be doing a live stream on the phone, or at least trying to, tomorrow around about midday, 1 o'clock. So again, feel free to drop by and say hello if you're in the area. So let's greet those who are in the chat so far. And be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. So Putin's shirt apparently can't sleep. Well, hopefully we keep you awake, because if this program was sending people to sleep, it is not what I was intending. We have Abtin joining us from Scandinavia. What country, who asks, what country are you from? Well, I'm from perfidious Albion, but I think you're referring to the previous commenter. Jay joins us, who says, there's a beautiful sunrise here in southeastern Virginia. Red Star Betty joins us from sunny Durham. Putin's shirt says, I'm from the belly of the beast. I was listening to Lukashenko's address to the Belarusian People's Assembly. He detailed down to troops and arms how NATO has completely surrounded Belarus. Scary. Well, yes, and this is a good point to raise, but it's also why Russia has had to essentially form a completely, well, largely unified joint defense with Belarus now. The Union State Treaty, which was signed back in its original form all the way back in 1997 between Lukashenko and Yeltsin, and then was implemented to varying degrees over the last 27 years. But it's now becoming more and more of a reality in terms of a union state. Belarus does not stand on its own. It's protected by the Russian nuclear umbrella. Any attempt to invade will be met with a very strong response. And the Belarusians have been redeveloping their military to be able to stand up to a NATO incursion. The plan, as I could see it from what Lukashenko and the other Belarusian government officials were saying, was that the Baltic reactionaries were trying to had some sort of insane plan with the Belarusian so-called opposition, in reality Belarusian traitors, who were planning to launch some kind of incursion, grab a piece of Belarusian territory, declare a provisional government, and then invite an invasion, which is an insane idea because it would necessitate a Russian military response. No doubt some of the more rabid elements in the NATO bloc think that this would be a good idea and it would knock the Russians off balance. But of course, they fail to take into account the fact that the Belarusian army would defend their own country. And of course, there is the Russians aren't restricted anymore in terms of the number of men they can mobilize. I'm not sure of the exact wording of the agreement between Belarus and Russia regarding deployment of military forces, but these Russians certainly have the manpower available now to deal with any attempted incursion into Belarus, combined with the Belarusian armed forces, and they have the air power to significantly damage anybody who tries it either. If anybody wanted to try that, then I think you'd be in they would be in a very difficult scenario. And I'll come to the difficulties revealed by the latest NATO exercises later on in the program. Good morning to Davey, who joins us from Bangor. Jawad joins us. Good morning to you. Carmo is with us. Grassy Knoll has joined us from Seattle, Washington. You had to set your alarm clock. Well, I hope it's worth it. Svetlana joins us from sunny Moscow. Will Johnson is with us. Jonas is with us. Kobe Mop is with us. Boyo says, Mad Dog's going into Rafah, but on the plus side, we see amazing scenes of solidarity outside US universities. Yes, more on that later. Muniz joins us from Denmark. CJ is with us from Virginia and says, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, indeed. Morgan joins us from the Emerald Isle. And Luca is with us from the Midlands of Perfidious Albion. Klavik is with us from Detroit. Putin's shirt says, my first boyfriend's father died of cancer from Agent Orange, leaving 2 young children fatherless. Jesus. That is a horrific legacy. Family was awarded $10,000 for that loss. I take it this guy was an American soldier who was killed by the chemical weaponry of his own side. Dan Kavalik is with us. Good to see you here, comrade. CE has finally managed to catch a live stream coming to us from NATO-occupied Sweden. Grassy Knoll says, motivation of combat troops is a very important strategic component of warfare that is overlooked. Yeah. It's something which none of the bozos who write for the Daily Telegraph, for instance, seem to understand. They see warfare as just like a game of toy soldiers that they can push them around. Motivation is vital. Morale is vital. And the more clever reactionaries do understand that. That's why they put so much into propaganda. But they lack an understanding of what makes morale. They just about got away with it. The British reactionaries did in World War One. There were revolts of British troops in World War One, but they've largely been covered up. There were much more significant, or even more significant, revolts of French troops in World War One, which we should really revisit on a future program, actually. There were revolts as soon as World War II ended in the American and the British armed forces. And, of course, the revolt of the Indian army immediately after World War II. So the mobilized men in World War II in Britain were prepared to accept, the various different rather piss-poor conditions they had to fight in and the sacrifices they were being asked to make, as long as it seemed as if the homeland itself was under threat. As soon as this was over, they revolted. They refused to be deployed anywhere else. And so this was part of why they were unable to wage a war on the Soviet Union. Their army wasn't prepared to fight on anymore. So this plan, I think it was called Operation Unthinkable, that lunatics like Field Marshal Montgomery came up with, had to be abandoned because they just didn't have the forces available to do it, and they would have lost anyway. Mr. Piece of Work, who says good morning from TX, I think that stands for Texas. I don't mock the state of Texas. I mean, yes, it's run by some desperate reactionaries these days, but the Texas proletariat will prove itself when the time comes. I'm sure it's no better or no worse than any other place in the imperialist centers. Bob Parr joins us from the US vassal state of Australia. Good to have you with us. David Greenwood is with us and says good morning, and I say good morning back. Royalist in Exile joins us and says good evening. I'm doing well, comrade. I hope you are too. Agitate says, agitate at the Tyne Valley Garden Center. Well, hope it's sunny where you are. Okay, so we have 100 people watching at this irregular time. As I say, be sure to like, share, or retweet this stream wherever you can. And we have begun by looking at the events from April the 30th, 1975. And now we move on to certain other things which are going on, of course, bringing this right up to date. So we look at the latest from the Ukraine war, where, of course, despite the release of the funding from the US Congress last week, there is little sign of any morale improvements, to draw on what was being said there just a moment ago, in the Ukrainian forces, who continue to lose significant ground, certainly in the Donbass regions. And this, of course, is the primary objective still of the Russian forces, to push the NATO forces, NATO proxy forces out of Donetsk, certainly, with additional objectives probably coming into view when that objective is met. So Zelensky continues to look desperate. Various different insane plans continue to fly around the opinion pages of various different imperialist journals. But the Wall Street Journal, and here I'll just do a quick share of the screen, revealed recently in an article that they had on their main website that for all the talk of battle readiness and all the talk of various different leaders of hell, we're going to get tough, we're going to face down those Russians, etc., etc. The actual readiness of the imperialists for an actual confrontation with the Russians isn't actually up to scratch. See, here we can see in the Wall Street Journal, which is one of two newspapers I actually subscribe to in the bourgeois press, the other one being the Financial Times. I do this so you can observe what's going on in the imperialist press, because it's in the WSJ, the FT, Daily Telegraph, that you actually get a lot of propaganda, certainly, but in the propaganda that they write there, you have more elements of truth about their motivations. And it's important to understand the motivations of the ruling class. Now, you can say the motivations of the ruling class are always to expand profits, and that's of course true, but you need to understand a little bit more than that, and I'll come to back to that in just a moment. But let's just go through this some of this Wall Street Journal article. So this focuses, as you can see here, on exercises that took place in Latvia across the last month or so, as part of the as what it's calls down here. You'll see I'm highlighting it. Operation, I'll do the action, Steadfast Defender 2024, which you always have to pronounce in a mock American accent because it sounds so fucking stupid. It's like Operation Prosperity Guardian or other very stupid titles they come up with. You know, their famous operation in the Red Sea in which they were defeated by the Yemenis. So they had this exercise where they were the American forces were playing the part of a fictionalized version of the Russians, and they're admitting in this Canadian lieutenant colonel who's photographed there looking like a bit of a tit, there's problems with the integration of the NATO armies. So if we go down here and highlight this, but the alliance is plagued by other disputes. They're talking about political disputes here. Leaders disagree on whether Ukraine and other aspiring members should be allowed to join. And Ukraine's never going to join, just to be clear. The contest to succeed Stoltenberg later this year has sparked acrimony between longtime members and newer ones and from the former Eastern Bloc. So what this is referring to is, of course, the fact that the various different Eastern European reactionaries, some of them say they're in favor of Ukraine joining. I don't think they actually are. I don't think that Duda and Tusk in Poland, for instance, are actually in favor of Ukraine joining NATO. I think they're being much more cynical than that. They're making a lot of public statements about it, but I don't think ultimately they're prepared to go all out and stick their necks on the line to try and push for Ukraine to join. The American imperialists are, of course, opposed to Ukraine joining NATO because they, on no account, want to risk their own men. They're prepared to have, as Lindsey Graham and Tony Blinken and Joe Biden and Donald Trump all agree, they're prepared to see hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of Ukrainians die in this outsourced war. And we'll come back to the disgraceful position on the Ukrainian refugee question later on. But they're not prepared to risk their own men. Because to go back to what we were saying a moment ago about the defeat of the Americans in Vietnam. Now, had the American imperialists had the complete support of the masses who would be prepared to die in horrifically large numbers for the purposes of this anti-communist crusade that the US imperialists were waging, then perhaps they could have won in Vietnam. It would have cost them millions of dead rather than the 50,000 that ultimately did die in that war, not counting, of course, the many who died later of suicide, alcoholism, and drug addiction, those who'd been wounded and never recovered. But assuming that, of course, they did have the full loyalty of their population, they could, of course, wage a more comprehensive war. But of course, they don't. The capitalists don't and never can have that degree of loyalty and commitment that a revolutionary army does, be it an army of national liberation or an army of national liberation led by communists. So the question of can Ukraine join NATO has to be addressed in those terms. The American reactionaries who run the US government, not the public-facing politicians, of course, who are many of whom are more stupid than your average concussed bumblebee. The nature of these people, of course, has to be understood in the sense that the politicians don't really decide anything. A lot of talk in the American reactionary about the state, the way that the state is organized, the bureaucracy of the imperial machine runs things, as was revealed on the Trump impeachment trial. So this bureaucracy, some of them at least, do have an understanding that if they asked American proletarians to die in large numbers against the Russians in Ukraine, it would be a horrifically destabilizing act for them to carry out, which is why, of course, they want an outsourced war. And that is the reason why Ukraine will have the prospects of NATO and EU membership continually dangled in front of it, but it will never be achieved. Just the same, by the way, as will be done with Armenia, with the pathetic comprador regime of Nikol Pashinyan. They'll be told over and over again that, Nikol, I'll do a posh British accent for this one. Nikol, old boy, don't worry. Your membership in NATO is coming. I'm sure it's in the post right now. Don't worry. You are a tremendously important country to us. We value our partnership with you a great deal. Now, if you could just remove yourself from the Collective Security Treaty Organization and all these other beastly Russian things that you're involved in, I'm sure that if you do that within 3 to 6 years, you'll be in the EU and you'll be as prosperous as Emmanuel Macron or something like that. And now the Armenians, of course, are being used, as many Armenians do know and recognize, and as are the Ukrainians. They will never be allowed to join NATO. They will never be allowed to join the EU. No, and I think in the case of Moldova, the only way that Western Moldova gets to join the EU or NATO is if it's swallowed by Romania. So this is a manipulation, of course, and the dance has been going on now for 2 years, and now Ukraine is facing an ever greater defeat. The American imperialists aren't going to agree to its membership, nor can we say that the British imperialists have added any solidity to Ukraine's defense by signing treaties with them and the Poles saying any future attack on Ukraine will be responded to in full by the British. So in other words, you're on your own, mate. So let's go down this article a little bit further. So what they're talking about here is also that there are significant logistical difficulties involved with the organization of NATO. So they mention in this article that that basically they haven't done any kind of exercise like this since 1988. So, for instance, back in 1988, half the armies that are in NATO now weren't in it back then. So it was an alliance reliant on Germany, Britain, and the United States, with the Italians playing a slightly lesser role. So here's a revealing passage, of course. So further up in the article, I'm going to highlight this, says, after the Cold War, differences in language, communication systems, and weaponry within NATO mattered little, because its troops rarely fought shoulder to shoulder. Instead, many rotated through short-term deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, planned long in advance. Equipment needs were clear, and each ally handled its own provisioning. So again, what that is talking about is the fact that NATO's had all these deployments over the last 20 years, and the Eastern European countries, including Ukraine, deployed troops and committed crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. but these were short-term deployments which didn't necessitate like the gigantic logistical operation that is required to keep a NATO army in the field in Eastern Europe, which of course none of them have the capability to actually carry out, as has been revealed by glaring inadequacies that are admitted to by official government reports in the United States and Britain. The United States and Britain don't have the industrial base, as we've covered many times here, that would enable them to resupply their forces, in terms of the material losses that would be incurred, again, by their own admission, in a shooting war with the Russians. The Americans also don't have the logistical setup necessary to resupply an army of theirs in Eastern Europe. If you think about this, even though the Americans have a substantial base network in Europe, this all has to be supplied from somewhere. And if you're in an open war with the Russians, then the Russians are going to be bombing your bases and bombing your supply lines, and they have the capability of doing that. So the Americans would then have to bring supplies in from where? Well, from the continental United States, which is thousands of miles across the sea. So you either have to fly in, and if you're in a shooting war with the Russians, they're going to try and shoot down your supply planes. And even though you can fly a fair amount via transport plane, you can't fly everything in that you would need to supply an army in the field to keep 100,000, 200,000 men supplied, which is what you'd need to fight the Russians and the Belarusians if you try and launch an incursion there. You'd need 200,000 odd men at the very least, and so you'd need to keep them fed. You'd need to keep them in ammunition. In terms of keeping their vehicles up to scratch. You need to keep your air force in the air and hope that it doesn't get shot down within the first few weeks. And you need to treat the wounded. You need to be able to evacuate the wounded to hospitals in the United States, probably, because the Russians would be bombing the bases in Germany and elsewhere. So this, when you start to look at it that way, and you start to look at the gigantic gap that exists between the fantasies of those who think that the war against those damn Ruskies will be over quickly, and the reality, which is it'll be an enormously difficult endeavor, which, again, some of these generals and admirals do actually admit to, and it will be something which, on the basis of logistics and supply, that the US would not be able to pull off. And none of the other countries in Europe can pull it off either. So again, this is why all of their war plans are predicated on a quick victory. They were predicated on a quick victory, when it was to be more a economic and political victory than it was to be military. The idea being that, to restate what we've said many times before, the idea being that back in 2021, 2022, that the Ukrainian NATO-trained army, which has now been almost completely destroyed, that original army of 220-odd thousand that was poised and ready to roll into Donetsk and Lugansk and ultimately to Crimea, they hoped, back in 2022. That army was supposed to roll in there, and if the Russians blinked and Putin opted for appeasement, then it would cause a crisis in Russia anyway, a crisis of the legitimacy of the Putin system. So that would be one way in which they hoped to secure regime change. Or the Russians did opt for a military intervention, which they ultimately did, and that this would be stymied, thwarted, the Russians wouldn't get anywhere, they would be able to create at least the appearance of dramatic defeats, which would then be spread around Russia by the paid oppositionists employed by the imperialists. And then the sanctions shock would hit, and there would be some kind of color revolution or palace coup against Putin, and that's how they would win. They never calculated for this kind of long-term military endeavor because they were unable to do it. They could throw, of course, they could throw the entire, all the warehouses of weaponry that they had left over from the Cold War into Ukraine. They could supply modern or more modern battle tanks in limited forms, in the Leopards, in the form of the Challenger 2s, in the form of the Abrams Mark II, and they could throw all kinds of other weaponry in there. But now, of course, it's all running short. Even with the additional funds that have been cleared by the US Congress, that's going to essentially to repurchase or pay for things which have already been sent to Ukraine, or fill up American stocks that have been drained by constantly supplying them over to Ukraine. Another point about logistics, supply, and production, according to reporting that came out recently in the American media, the number of Abrams tanks that can be produced every month inside the United States is 12. So if that's 12 per month, that's what, 144 per year? Now, according to different estimates, at higher end and lower end, the Russian tank factories at places like Ural Gonzavod can produce, again, estimates vary. Lower end estimate 600, higher end estimate 1,000 tanks per year. So that's almost, if we go with the higher end estimates, that's almost 10 times what the Americans can produce in terms of the Abrams. And of course, you have in Russia the enormous capacity for respecking or updating technology and vehicles that they've had in storage since the days of the Soviet Union. So, for instance, they can update their T-64s, T-75 tanks. They've even updated and turned them into mobile guns, the old T-55 tank, which was laughed at when they started to do it. But they had to concede recently, American press did, via interviews with Ukrainian personnel, that in actual fact the Ukrainians were suffering due to the firepower of the reconditioned or upgraded T-55, which was being used as essentially a fixed place gun. So this is turned into an absolute disaster. Again, the reason why we're covering all of this is that we see from the Wall Street Journal's article that they have communication problems, they have internal disputes in NATO, and that's the Wall Street Journal admitting to that. Because the reason why that's in the Wall Street Journal is because, again, it's a ruling class paper. It covers things that the ruling class want out there. And a certain section in the American ruling class want to make it clear that NATO's in no condition to fight, and Ukraine is not going to be allowed to join. This brings us to another tremendously cynical maneuver from the imperialists, which is, of course, the state of play with regard to Ukrainian refugees, particularly men in Central and Eastern and indeed Western Europe. So a story came out yesterday via the Ukrainian leak channel, basically. There's two big channels on Telegram which deal with leaks from the internal discussions within the Ukrainian regime. So there's been talk for a while now from the Kiev regime about what they're going to do with regard to this mobilization. I mean, as you will have all seen, the various different pictures coming out of Ukraine of these press gangs going around beating the shit out of guys and throwing them into vans. And the Russian joke is, well, there's another Abrams tank driver. So that's the brutal reality. But the other factor is, of course, that in the beginning of the special military operation, of course, there was over 2 million Ukrainians fled to Russia, which is never mentioned. That was the single biggest destination for Ukrainians. But in terms of Ukrainian refugees who have fled into Europe itself, and this is information that comes from the EU's own website, according to them. Now, there's nearly 1,958,000 refugees in Poland, Ukrainian refugees in Poland. There's 357,000 in the Czech Republic. There is 1,194,000 inside Germany, 135,000 in the Netherlands, 71,000 in Belgium, 64,000 in France, 161,000 in Italy, 140,000 in Romania, 166,000 in Bulgaria, 109,000 in Slovakia, 26,000 in Greece, and 94,000 in the Republic of Ireland. British figures aren't noted on the EU map. I'm just going to look those up now while I'm talking to you. So you can see there, that's a very large number particularly in Germany, Poland, and some of the other countries as well. And the Ukrainian, more specifically the Kiev regime, wants to get those people back. And more specifically, they want to get the men back. And they've tried various different administrative maneuvers, such as trying to get the Ukrainian embassies overseas to not issue new passports. They'll probably try and withhold banking services to them, eventually cut them off from their money, all to force them to go back to Ukraine. And if you look at the totals, again, I'm going to just call up the figures here again. So over 1 million in Germany, almost 1 million in Poland. So if we assume in total around there, that's 2 million in Poland and Germany alone. Let's assume that half of those, or slightly less than half of those, are men. Again, we're making certain assumptions here in terms to try and come up with some figures. If we assume that around about half of them are men, or maybe less than half of them are men, so that's going to be, let's say, 800,000 to 1 million. Lower end estimate, 800,000 are men. And now a man of fighting age in Ukraine is basically now anybody who is between the age of, like, well, they say it's 24, 25. To assume that they're going to say that everybody in that 800-odd thousand, again, let's use the lower end estimate, is liable for military service unless they're like missing both legs. And again, we've seen people with missing limbs be press ganged into service in Ukraine. They're going to say that all 800,000 of those have to return to Ukraine. Now, according to Legitimacy, one of the big Ukrainian leak channels, the deal is being pushed through between the Europeans and the Kiev regime that they will return, or help the Kiev regime return, the refugee men in particular, if the Kiev regime commits to another offensive in later 2024 or early 2025. Now, if you're following the way that the war is going in the east of Ukraine, this is a complete fantasy, given that they are losing ground more and more rapidly every single day, that they have lost gigantic amounts of men, that more and more Ukrainian troops are surrendering to the Russians. Again, this is talk not just coming from Russian channels, this is also coming from Ukrainian channels. The Ukrainian regime, the Kiev regime, refuses to comment on any of this, but they're losing ground, they're losing large numbers of men. There are large surrenders going on. So, and of course, there is a equipment and supply problem in the fact that the Europeans and the United States cannot supply enough equipment in time. So quite what they're going to do, even if they manage to get 800,000 men forced back into Ukraine, which I don't think they're going to get, quite how they're going to equip them, train them, etc., when their front line is falling apart is another question. But it reveals the depth of the cynicism of the Comprador regime in Kiev and the brutish cynicism of the US and the European imperialists. They're quite prepared to march off another 1 million men, 800,000 to 1 million men, into the jaws of death. To do what? Well, as Boris Johnson said the other day, to preserve Western hegemony. That's what it's all about. I'm glad he's come out into the open and said it now, because it strips away the bullshit. And so the question is, are they going to be able to do this? And I don't think they are. I think that as it becomes more and more obvious what's going on in eastern Ukraine, and also bear in mind, a lot of these people will have family connections back in Ukraine itself, and will know, or have a decent idea of the number of casualties there. So a lot of these guys, if the Ukrainian regime tries to call them up, are going to go to ground and try to hide out in the countries that they're in, or refuse to cooperate. And if you walk around a major urban center, any of the major cities in Britain today, you'll see Ukrainians working in various different service sector jobs. So the chances are that these people aren't going back. Not now, not ever. They're here probably to stay. They'll never go back to Ukraine as it currently stands. Maybe if a new version of Ukraine that is stable emerges, ruled by either the Russians directly or a government which is incorporated into some kind of political union with Russia, perhaps some of them would go back. But certainly, if they're going to try and do some sort of mass deportation exercise of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men into a war situation, which is absolutely hopeless, and everybody can see that it's hopeless, that isn't going to play very well at all. There's going to be protests, there's going to be objections, and these people have, to a certain extent, rooted themselves in some of the working class communities they do live in. So there's going to be objections. So I don't think that the Kiev regime can possibly expect to get 800,000 men back from Western Europe or Eastern Europe. So they're probably looking for around about half of that. I mean, would they even get that half? Again, that's questionable. But it's worth noting that this is the brute cynicism of the compradors that run Kiev now. They are prepared to have Ukraine burnt to absolute ashes to do what? Mainly to save themselves, because their only way out, Zelensky, Siersky, Yermak, and the others, their only way out now, they've gone too far. They can't surrender to the Russians now. The only deal that the Russian government is going to accept is complete capitulation. And so their only way out is to carry on obeying the instructions of the US imperialists, which are keep the war going at all costs. And so they will obey every diktat that comes from Washington in terms of keeping the war going, in the hope that they know very well it's going to shit. They just hope that they can get out before the final collapse comes, or when the final collapse comes. Zelensky, Yermak, Siersky, and others will be on the plane. Maybe not Siersky. Maybe he'll choose to surrender. But certainly the political leadership in Kiev, those who have spent the last decade enriching themselves, will be sticking their dollars in a briefcase and running to the airport in the hope that the Americans will let them buy a villa in Miami. And that's the brutish cynicism of compradors. Same was true for the Vietnamese comprador regime. The Kiev comprador regime is probably even less honorable and even more dirty. So that's where things stand at the moment. So let's just pause here to see where we've got to. Kobe says Poland is a net negative contributor to the EU. They leech off Germany and the EU a lot. Well, yes, they do, but they're useful. They're a useful battering ram for the US imperialists. That's why they're there. Pulses Digital says Russia doesn't need any war. They want to trade with many European countries. This absurd lies from the West that Russia want to invade another European countries is disgusting. Yes, they are absurd lies. But what the Russian ruling group had to come to realize was that there would be no peaceful coexistence. The only way that the US imperialists and the European imperialists, France, Britain, Germany, etc., would accept any kind of Russia to be in existence was if it was one that was a complete slave to the imperialists, one that was completely dominated by the imperialists. They were prepared to grudgingly accept the Putin system for a while, but because he insisted on certain things such as sovereignty and control over the energy sources, they were prepared to let the Europeans and American companies in, but only on the basis that they were going to operate as broad equals in terms of the exploitation of the mineral resources of Russia, not that they were going to be able to hyper exploit them in terms of all the profits being taken out of the country. So again, like the Russian Putin and the other rulers in the ruling group in Russia had to learn this painful lesson that the only Russia that the US was prepared to accept was one that it completely controlled, or one that was broken up. So it's an unfortunate reality, but one that they've had to come to understand, i.e. the nature of imperialism. Grassy Knoll said, when Admiral Zumwalt's son, who had served in Vietnam, died from Agent Orange, the Veterans Administration medical care system started recognizing the horrible effects of this poison. So it took a senior officer's son dying for them to work it out, or to at least acknowledge it. Putin's shirt says, 3 more years of Washington's tool Pashinyan destroying Armenian sovereignty before re-election. Well, look, the Armenians will have to realize, I'm sure I know many of them do, that again, you can't have a relationship with Washington in the way that Armenia has had it over the last 20 to 30 years. You can't allow Washington and the Europeans to run amok in your country. You can't allow the NGOs, which are just literally extensions of the American state and the various states of Europe. You can't allow the NGOs freedom of operation. You can't allow large numbers of your population to be paid by them. You can't allow them to take over large areas of your education and media system. This is what Armenia did, not just in the last 5 years. I mean, Nikol Pashinyan didn't flash into existence with his scruffy beard and ill-fitting suit in 2018. He's the product of a decades-long operation run by the US and the French, in particular, imperialists, aided by large numbers of the reactionary Armenian diaspora. So the Armenians in Armenia itself have got to realize that, and I think they do, many of them anyway, that the enemy is not just sitting in Yerevan. He's just a manifestation of it. The enemy is in the fact that many Armenians have been pressed into the service of imperial powers who are prepared to destroy Armenia in the service of their own ends, which are trying to cause problems for the Russians in the Caucasus. And they're prepared to see Armenia destroyed in the pursuit of those aims. Until they get to the point where they're prepared to overthrow Pashinyan, get rid of him and his clique, but also to shut down the operations of the NGO system funded by Washington, and to restrict the activities of the US imperialists themselves, force the US imperialists to scale down their embassy operations. They have a gigantic embassy in Yerevan because they've essentially taken over the running of the state. So again, this is what some in the Georgian ruling class have realized, hence the presence of the so-called Georgian Dream Party in government, that they need to restrict the actions of the foreign agencies in their country, because otherwise they're just going to be shoved into a war with the Russians, which they will ultimately lose, and they will get destroyed, as they were nearly destroyed in 2008. And the Armenians have to go through a similar process of reckoning. Again, like consciousness lags behind material reality. And so ultimately, the Armenians will have to reckon with the comprador forces in their country. And they'll have to reckon with the power of the US and the power of the European countries in their country, and the power of the Armenian diaspora in France and in the United States in particular, which seems to be absurdly reactionary and completely has completely turned itself into a tool of imperialism. All of those are problems which the Armenians will have to wrestle with. I think they ultimately will. Ultimately, also, what might preserve what's left of the territorial integrity of Armenia is the fact that certainly the Iranians aren't prepared to see the Azerbaijanis completely take over the land corridor that connects Armenia to Iran. So that might give some pause to the activities of the imperialists there, but we'll have to see. But yes, this is what happens when a weak ruling class allows essentially the US and the French in particular to take over the running of so-called civil society in their country. You end up with a government run by pure compradors. Rodney says, through want of the nail, the shoe was lost. Logistics is everything in war. Just ask Napoleon. Well, I'll ask the real Napoleon, not the Joaquin Phoenix version. Racinol said Admiral Zumwalt gave the order to use the chemical agent orange in Vietnam. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Eamon, good morning to you over there in Cork. Puddin Shirt says that WSJ article might be imperialists' way of justifying increasing military spending. Well, it might be, but as we've discussed before, increasing military spending doesn't mean that you're going to get anything more in terms of the problems that we've been talking about. All it means is it's going to disappear into the pockets of shareholders. Look, the US military industrial complex has a lot of money spent on it, but as we've seen, it isn't anything like as efficient as the Russian version. The Russian version, of course, built in the Soviet era largely, and built even now on Soviet lines. So what you've got in the United States is a tremendously inefficient resource sponge that soaks up money and adds to shareholder profits, but doesn't actually result in much of an increase in production. I mean, even when it comes to this pier that they're building off the coast of Gaza, which we don't actually have time to get to today, but I will return to on Thursday probably. the cost of that already has gone way up above $300 million because it's been outsourced a couple of times. So that, like, you can sink a lot more money. Like, the Americans could double their already enormous military budget, and it might not buy them much more of anything. It might just guarantee that more money leaks out of a sieve-like system. I mean, even some Republican congressman was holding up a bag of bolts that cost like $30, was it? I'm not sure of the exact number, in China, and it costs like $900 in the United States, partially because of like the fragmented and outsourced nature of the system, whereby you've got a dozen different companies producing like one component or something, where money leaks out at each stage of the contract. So yes, they can get more defense spending, but is it going to lead to anything more actually being produced, given how inefficient American capitalist production is now in this late stage of imperialism? Jeremy Turner, good morning to you. Kobe says Russia should be grateful of their Soviet past, inheriting a powerful military and a fraction of its industrial capacity. Well, everything they can do is based on that. Putin's shirt says recently Putin referred to Stalin as father of nations. It's been many decades since I heard that term of endearment. The Kremlin has also been erecting new monuments to Stalin. Yeah, the reputation of Stalin has been improved, I think, largely by the KPRF, who that's an area that they deserve great credit for. They have been consistent in their defense of Stalin over the period of their existence. So even if I do disagree with them, they still continue to cover up the Lenin mausoleum on Victory Day, which I think is obscene. Hopefully, though, we are seeing a slow reversal. You see, it used to be in the Khrushchev and Gorbachev revisionist period, Khrushchev to Gorbachev revisionist period, you attacked Stalin to attack Lenin. And this is what Khrushchev did and Gorbachev did. And then the idea, it's a guy called Zinoviev, I think, Alexander Zinoviev, who was an advisor to Gorbachev, said we attacked Stalin in order to attack Lenin. Then we use, what is it they say? They attacked Stalin to get to Lenin. Then they use Plekhanov to dismantle Lenin. Then they use Marx to dismantle Plekhanov. Then they use anything to dismantle Marx. So maybe we're seeing a reverse in that. You're now seeing slowly the rehabilitation, the entirely correct rehabilitation of the reputation of Stalin, and that eventually will lead to the rehabilitation in official Russian terms of Lenin. And that will be rather awkward for the Russian government, just as the fact that they're now having to, they're now admitting that their previous acknowledgement of Soviet guilt for the Katyn massacre was a lie. So recently the Russian intelligence services released loads of records from their archive showing that the Katyn massacre was actually done by the Nazis. The Gorbachev, I think, and Putin and Medvedev carried out an acknowledgement of what was essentially a fake crime, a stitch-up job by the Nazis, digging up these bodies of Polish officers who they'd killed and saying that the Soviets did it, in an effort to try and divide the alliance that was arrayed against them in 1945. And again, it was taken up by the anti-communists to discredit the Soviet Union. And eventually, the Comprador clique, led by Gorbachev, just admitted to every crime that was alleged by the anti-communists, even though, of course, hardly any of them were true. And Putin later did it in order, basically, to try and secure better relations, trading relations, especially with the Europeans. Now, though, we're seeing the Russian government reverse course on that and start to say, well, it was actually done by the Nazis. Of course, this isn't being addressed by Putin or Medvedev themselves, who are the ones who acknowledged the fake Soviet guilt for this massacre that was ultimately done by the Nazis. But we'll see how that develops as time goes on. Okay. Will Johnson says, so we've got Michael joining us, who has a very nice red and gold harp as his symbol. Amar joins us from sizzling Karachi, Pakistan. Putin's shirt says Western media persist in pushing the story of revolution against a FARA law in Georgia, but they give away the imperialist failure by admitting the protests are only a few thousand strong. Yeah, I think that the worm has turned, shall we say, on that particular incident. I don't think they're going to succeed in Georgia, and the defeat in Ukraine will mean basically that being a comprador is a lot less appealing, particularly if several of them end up, shall we say, with the Mussolini treatment. Will Johnson says $8 for bushings in China, 90,000 charge for the bushings to the US Air Force. 90 grand? Bloody hell, I was underestimating. So there's an example, you know. It's essentially over 10,000 times more expensive to get the same thing in the US. And that's not just because of a difference in labor costs either. That's a gigantic amount of corruption involved as well. Ben joins us from Southwest Hungary. Good to have you with us. Boyo, glad you're enjoying the content here. Kobe says Stalin was Lenin's most faithful student and relied heavily on Lenin's work to guide him in state affairs. That's very true. Kailash says, is the idea of a US military weakness just a psyop? No, it's not. And you can observe that it's not by just tracking what internal reports say about US military preparedness going back many, many years. And of course, the performance of the US military in places like Afghanistan. And you can look at like the sheer level of corruption. It's not just military weakness in terms of morale of service personnel. It's also their crisis in recruitment. The crisis in recruitment is not a psyop. The crisis in recruitment comes from the fact that the US masses don't want to fight for the profits of the ruling class, even though they might not understand it that way. The masses understand that the wars being waged are not in their interests and so won't join up, which is why their military recruitment standards have been lowered continually over the last 20 years. They barely even got much of a blip in terms of the downward spiral of recruitment after 9/11. They got something of a surge after 9/11. They didn't get anything that was sustainable in terms of the numbers. So no, it's not a psyop. This is real. Like, if they had the capability of actually winning the war in Afghanistan, wouldn't they have chosen to do that? If they had the capability of holding Iraq and turning it into a more reliable puppet state, they would have done that. If they had the capability to deploy and genuinely scare off the Russians in Ukraine, then they might have done that. The reason why they're doing all this outsourced stuff and the reason why they're so opposed to Ukraine joining NATO is precisely because they know their weaknesses quite well and are prepared to have the Ukrainians die in vast numbers rather than come face to face with those weaknesses. Kobe says Trotsky instead just sees himself as above Lenin while Stalin doesn't. Trotsky saw himself as above everybody. That was part of his problem. But you're right. Yes, Kobe's right. They did throw a bone to try to appease the West by admitting to the Katyn massacre, which they knew very well, Putin would have known very well, was faked. The Soviet responsibility wasn't real. It was the Nazis who did it. Putin's shirt says at the Valdai Forum last year, Putin was asked point blank if it wasn't time for Russia to embrace Lenin's greatness. You don't often see Putin falter publicly, but it was evident that he was taken off guard. Yeah. Because I think he knows it's a question that he's uncomfortable with, because I think he does understand on some level that Lenin is this great figure. But again, it's difficult for this iteration of the Russian government to deal with Lenin. Like, you can just about now, not officially, but you can have the comeback of Stalin and call him like the father of the nation or something. He can't deal with the Lenin legacy. They can't really even deal with Stalin's legacy. They can create, and this is what Dugin's doing, by the way. Dugin is often the man who, he doesn't speak for Putin or anything like that. That's a silly Western caricature. But he's clearly doing the work for trying to build some kind of unified theory of Russian identity and thinking. So he's been trying to fit Stalin into that. He's probably going to try and fit Lenin into that as well, but that's going to be tremendously difficult. So they currently don't know what to do with Lenin. It's the reason why they they don't remove the mausoleum because it would stir up too much opposition. They just try and hide it every year. Eventually, though, the position's going to be unsustainable because, again, they're having to go back on so much that various Soviet revisionists conceded to the imperialists, be it Gorbachev or all the way back to Khrushchev, that eventually they're going to have to essentially, at the very least, admit what go to the Chinese formulation on Stalin, which was the Chinese formulation on Mao, which I don't agree with, by the way, which is 70% good, 30% bad. They're going to have to do something like that. If they're now admitting that the Katyn massacre story was a lie, they're going to have to also then reckon with the real history of the Baltic states and why they joined the USSR. They're going to have to reckon with all of the lies that have been told about the USSR in the Great Patriotic War, which the Soviet leadership did do. They issued a book after World War II combating the anti-communist lies that were already being spread about World War II. So again, bit by bit, they're having to admit that all the things that Gorbachev and Khrushchev and Yeltsin said about the communist era were lies. And again, not something that I think the younger Putin would have wanted to do, but reality is just pushing him in that direction because so much of the material resilience of Russia is built on the Soviet legacy. They can't escape it. Boyo says, I think the American working class know on some level the wars are for the ruling class. It's blurring and clear in their minds, but it's there. Yeah, it is. Yeah. The American worker isn't stupid. Like the American worker and the British worker understand that none of these wars are for them because they can look at their own material conditions and see they've had all these wars and all this money spent and none of the benefits have come to them. Their lives got worse. So why sacrifice for an elite which not only do you hate it hates you right back and is making your life objectively worse? If you're from like Ohio, why would you go and fight for any American administration, given that they literally were prepared to see a major part of your state, in the East Palestine toxic rail disaster, turned into a toxic waste dump? Why would you go and fight for that? Why? You don't need to be any kind of communist to reach the conclusion that the ruling class hate you or just regard you as completely expendable. So why would you go and do anything for them? They were able to sustain themselves for as long as they did after World War II because of the concessions of the New Deal period. That's all gone now. So what is there for the American worker to fight for? The American worker will fight to defend the American homeland, but no one's invading the American homeland. Unless Justin Trudeau gets really mad. But there's no threat to the American homeland from anybody. The Chinese aren't invading, the Russians aren't invading. So they're not going to go off and fight in Ukraine or Taiwan or anywhere else. And I think some of the American reactionaries know that very well. Quite how they address it is another question. Kobe says, personally not a fan of Dugin, but other communists like him. I have no time for Dugin's ideas. I have no time for his political approach. I don't think you can combine Dugin's reactionary idealism with Marxist thought, just as you can't combine Heidegger with Marxist thought. Various people have tried to do it. It's eclecticism, and it leads you towards reactionary conclusions, which is why I oppose it. Dallas Ken says it's not surprising they would try to frame the Soviets for the Katyn massacre. Here in the States, they're still trying to frame Oswald for killing Kennedy. Interesting. But yes, yeah, I agree with you. Grassy Knoll says not only is the US having a difficult time recruiting new people to fill the ranks, but the military is losing large numbers of enlisted personnel that are quitting their service. Also, like, what's the is it Fort Bragg where all those like horrendous crimes were reported? Like that's an example of like extreme degeneration and demoralization, where you've got tens or hundreds of murders going on, vast drug dealing networks, sex trafficking networks, pedophiles serving openly almost in the military, enlisted men killing each other in disputes over drug deals, organized crime rackets being run out of the military. I mean, this isn't something which he's ready to go and march off and fight the Russians. Yeah, the Russian military will have its share of some of those problems as well. It is, after all, a capitalist army, but nothing like what the Americans have got. Good morning, I think, to Shanika McAdams, who has joined us. Ben says there was a Bloomberg opinion piece over the weekend making the outsourcing explicit. Europe and the UK need full war footing because relying on the US for defense is short-sighted. Yeah, but they can't do it. That's the thing. The British government says that they're going to raise defense spending to 2.5% of GDP in 5 years' time. Sorry, 6 years' time. So that's not war economy urgent style. I mean, it took full nationalization and state control over the entirety of the war industries and agriculture for the British to be able to just sustain themselves in World War II, because the industrial base and the agricultural base had already decayed significantly by that time. And that's 80 years ago, 85 years ago. Now there's barely any manufacturing left. Like we import 50% of our food, much more than we did back then. Like the supply chains for what's left of British industry stretch all the way around the world. They're not even, and that's before we even take into account the rate of profit question for British industry. So not only would you need to have state control over all of it, you would need to spend much more than 5 years, because you'd need to retrain a whole new generation of technicians to run this industrial base you say you want to expand. You can't just magic up the specialists in arms production overnight. You need to train a whole new generation of people, or retrain a whole new section of people to work in these industries, because you just don't have the numbers at the moment. You don't have the education system in place. So you'd need to do a complete re-engineering of the British economy and reverse trends that have been in place for nearly a century. Now, it's possible that they could do that, but you would need a very powerful, a very well entrenched, essentially fascist regime to do that. Now, don't rule it out that they would try, but there's enormous difficulties for them in doing so, and we would have opportunities for a revolutionary process. Right. Okay. Probably the reason shut off access to the Soviet archives. Yes, there's certain bits of the Soviet archives which have remained sealed. Those are the bits that will be the parts that exonerate Stalin and the revolutionary period. That's the reason why they're sealed or destroyed, is because they contradict the narrative that has been established ever since Khrushchev. In addition to the ridiculous 2.5% by 2030, the Germans and Italians are planning the future tank Wunderwaffe by 2040. Shows the urgency, doesn't it? We'll have it in 15 years. Svetlana says, appreciation of the USSR here in Russia is growing apace, maybe due to the SMO. Stalin is being reassessed in a positive light. Being anti-Stalin is increasingly seen as being anti-Russian. Well, hopefully that'll also lead to the great man being appreciated more in his homeland of Georgia, of course. Yeah, with the imperialists have managed, via their hostility to Russian capitalism, to re-establish the reputation of Russian communism, which is something that really we should put up statues to Joe Biden over. A certain section of the British ruling class does want to put in a corporatist state. However, they generally prefer liberalism because it's more stable for them, says Kobe. Yeah, there is a fascist wing of the British ruling class. There always has been. Again, though, we come back to capability. You can say you want to put in this ruthless state which will be prepared to do horrendous things to the working class in order to restore industrial production, but you can't just restore it overnight like that. Even with a fascist state, it would take years. And that's why I say we'd have many opportunities to chase them out of power before then. All right. Okay. So we are now at 12:15. I have to get going because I've got a train to catch in an hour. Thank you to the 202 of you who are with us so far. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. Keep an eye out for a live stream popping up tomorrow from the London May Day event. But I'll be back with you again on Thursday of this week. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in, and I will see you again soon.